Talofa lava, this is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific. I'm Susanna Suisuiki. Coming up.
Long time process. Someone says 8 years, someone says 10 years.
Asylum seekers are again being held in Nauru. Also,
some of them probably maybe feeling dejected, maybe feeling demotivated perhaps, maybe feeling upset.
With Fiji First Party deregistered, who will hold Fiji's government to account? And
we don't want to be just sailing the smooth seas.
PNG's communication minister says he's open to criticism. Almost 100 asylum seekers are again being held in Australia's offshore processing centre in Nauru after numbers dropped to zero in June last year. New Zealand agreed to resettle 450 refugees on Nauru in 2022 until mid-2025, but the government says this latest cohort is ineligible. Caleb Fotheringham has more.
My local driver is taking me to Australia's detention centres in Nauru. It's where Australia puts people who have arrived by boat as asylum seekers on an island the size of Rangitoto, sitting only 50 kilometres south of the equator. They will never be allowed to settle in Australia. Mohammed Anjum is in Regional Processing 1, where about 90 asylum seekers are being held before moving into the community. He asked if he could be visited by RNZ Pacific, but was told the request needed to go through the Nauru government, which he doesn't have access to. So RNZ called him instead.
No humanity here. Just treating like animal. There is no feeling.
Authorities in Nauru have been famously hostile to journalists. My driver, fearing serious repercussions, says if anyone asks, say you're a hitchhiking tourist. In 2018, police detained TVNZ reporter Barbara Drever for interviewing asylum seekers in the community. It's what we're doing in a place locally known as IU Camp. We see some but have to keep driving because security is nearby and have another crack later in the night.
Okay, good. Perfect. No security yet.
What's your name?
My name.
We managed to talk to a small group on the street. Muhammad Ahmed tells me, like everyone else, he doesn't know how long he will stay on Nauru, only that it will be a long process.
Long time process. Someone says 8 years, someone says 10 years.
Despite language barriers, the group manages to tell us they've been treated well, but are struggling to survive on their monthly allowance of 460 Australian dollars.
Not enough. We are very expensive. Everything. Price very expensive.
Back at Regional Processing Centre 1, Mohammed Anjum says access to healthcare and mental health specialists is difficult. He has asked 3 times to be seen by an eye specialist and is still waiting.
There is only one GP, just for the fever or the normal thing. But if it is a little bit harder, for example, the eye disease, air problem, the teeth problem, no specialist here.
In a rare media stand-up with pre-approved questions, Nauru's President David Adiyang says the Regional Processing Centre has not damaged Nauru's international standing.
I think it has done a lot for Nauru. It, at one stage, cured all of our unemployment issues. But I do think that the journalists need to be a bit more fair, a bit more balanced. I know that in the hundreds of reports, possibly thousands of reports regarding the RPC, only one has been balanced. And I think that the problem is not the RPC, it might be the attitude of certain journalists.
He also says health complaints like Mohammed Anjum's are overblown.
We have hundreds of people looking after 101 refugees here. Of course, our medical facilities here are not as what may be expected by others. But what we do is we send them overseas. Now, if he does have a case to be treated overseas, he will be sent overseas to be treated.
My local driver holds a similar sentiment to the President, saying when Australia set up the detention centre, it was a flashback to the glory days when phosphate mines brought economic prosperity. He believes many of the asylum seekers are living better than the locals, with air conditioning and free healthcare. New Zealand's Foreign Affairs Minister Winston Peters, who was in Nauru on Thursday, says countries must be able to pick and choose who enters.
Countries have a right to say the first thing that concerns us and our responsibility as politicians is the law and order and security of the people in their homes, in their streets and in their businesses. Those are fundamental rights. No one has a right to say, I'm going to land in Australia and I'll do what I want. and I'm going to become now the responsibility of the Australian people.
In June 2022, New Zealand agreed to resettle 450 refugees until 2025 from Nauru under the Australia Refugee Resettlement Agreement. Around 170 refugees have been resettled, and all the refugees that are currently being considered are now in Australia. A government spokesperson says those currently in Nauru are not eligible under the resettlement agreement. Mr. Peters had this to say when asked if New Zealand should take refugees from the latest intake.
Are these people entitled to jump the queue against people who are applying to come to New Zealand legitimately as part of our immigration program and our responsibilities for international engagements?
In the meantime, Mohammed Anjum and the other asylum seekers remain uncertain about their future.
Fiji's former ruling party was stripped of its legal status for not complying with electoral laws, leaving the country without a unified opposition. Local media are reporting Fiji First, which was the largest political party in Parliament, has its 26 MPs already split, with at least 10 considering joining Prime Minister Sitiveni Rabuka's coalition. While Fijian voters agree the deregistration of the former Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama's party is fair, they say the nation still needs a strong opposition to keep government accountable. Grace Vivai has more.
The deregistration is fair because, the party failed to comply in terms of whether having an opposition is important or not.
The logistics of the party, and it is very important to have opposition in order to keep the nation going and transparent.
It was just over 18 months ago when Fiji First lost power with a one-vote majority. But fast forward to July 2024, the most popular political movement of the last 16 years, and the main parliamentary opposition has ceased to exist. The Fiji Times editor Fred Wesley says people who voted for Fiji First will be disappointed.
This is certainly going to have an impact on the people on the ground and on all Fiji First supporters. Some of them probably may be feeling dejected, maybe feeling demotivated perhaps, maybe feeling upset over the turn of events.
The whole situation emerged because Fiji First simply failed to make amendments required under the country's political party laws. The founders, including Bainimarama, resigned, leaving the party defunct even before deregistration. A former opposition leader, Mick Beddoes, says Fiji First could have easily accommodated the constitutional requirements needed save itself.
And as far as I'm concerned, the implosion through their own mishandling of things of Fiji First is not a crisis. It's just a failure of that political party, and there's multiple parties that have come and contested and then wound up and left, including my party. Because
Mr. Beddoes says there is more to the deregistration of Bainimarama's party than meets the eye.
They failed to make the amendments required of it by the supervisor of elections within the time frame that they were given. The executive of the party, knowing all of that, should have met, I would assume were meeting, and could have dealt with that.
Those Fiji First MPs left standing are now independents. Prime Minister Sitiveni Rabuka has hinted he would entertain former Fiji First MPs joining his team pack. But for Pramila Kumar, a former Fiji First cabinet minister, who is now independent MP staying on the opposition benches to hold the coalition government to account, is the principal objective. She is preparing her response to next week's budget.
As an opposition member, we are preparing a response to the 2024-2025 national budget, and the effort continues. But the only way we can test this out is in the parliament next week to see how people are responding to the budget.
The opposition grouping says they have been approached by some parties, but a decision on who was joining who has not been made. But Mr. Beddoes says while it's not clear what will happen with Fiji First's former MPs, how they react or respond to government policies next week will be revealing.
What we're seeing is necessarily what the total picture is, so I'll just put that aside. We will start to see how the chips fall in the conduct of the individual in opposition and how they will handle the matter of the budget debate.
Fiji's Labour Party and a former Prime Minister, Mahendra Chaudhry, says having opposition is essential for democracy. Mr. Childi says so far some of Fiji First's MPs have approached him, but no decision has been made. Meanwhile, political commentator Seiran Booker's comments around forming a potential government.
Some people have approached us, but at the moment we have not taken.
Papua New Guinea's Communication Minister says he's open to criticism regarding the government's proposed new media policy. Timothy Masil was speaking at the Pacific International Media Conference held in Fiji's capital, Suva. The proposed new media policy, which has been heavily criticised, is now in its 5th edition. Mr. Masil told Moira Tule Patela he welcomes that criticism.
We have definitely been open to some criticisms, and it's good to get critics, because that's what makes us strong, and that's what makes us want to move forward. And the critics are good for us, because that's what we want to hear. We don't want to be just sailing the smooth seas, but we want to hear critics as well, so that we can realign our thinking and how we want to make sure that the policy it's accepted widely, from our people.
And the piece about media output edifying, is that public media, or is that what type of media?
Edifying is not something that anyone should be concerned about. It is a word we are using in terms of describing what we want to do. We want to make sure that the media knows its roles and responsibilities. And that is important, because today there are so many people who are not graduated media people, people who have not gone to media schools or even journalism schools, who are writing. And these people are accepted. They're accepted by media companies to come in and do some work for them, but the code of ethics is not there. They don't really understand what a media person or a journalist should be writing about. So we want to use that as an avenue to correct these people. If they are good enough to write, we send them to school. Give them support, funding support, so that they can go and attend the journalism schools, or their people can look after them in terms of providing the training program for them.
I'm just going to be cheeky and ask you too, do you think MPs understand the role of the media too in PNG?
I'm not really sure about that. I think people just see the news and they just talk about the media. Media is more than that. It's an industry on its own. It's a pillar on its own. You have the freedom of media, and that's what we want to protect in Papua New Guinea. And I will say that not all MPs understand what media is.
Samoa's Supreme Court has issued a warning for those who abuse custom and tradition, particularly the ifonga, a traditional Samoan apology to get reduced jail time. It follows the recent sentencing of a man for manslaughter. Judge Justice Vui Clarence Nelson told the man the ifonga he did was an attempt to lessen the court's punishment and was not acceptable. I caught up with the University of Auckland's teaching fellow, Beatrice Tambankora, who explains the significance of the traditional Samoan apology, otherwise known as the ifonga.
One thing, I think that it is very well timed. I do believe that there have been criticisms of how there is the unfortunate potential for abuse of Samoan custom and traditions. And I do think that a stern warning from the judiciary was something that was always going to happen in due time. You can see this in sort of some of the cases that have been coming out from the Samoan courts, in that they have started to question the genuineness of the intention behind some of the ifonga that have been performed, and it's quite interesting to see. So I do think it was something that was always going to happen, and it's very unfortunate though that it has had to happen.
I'm going to get back to you on that around the genuineness of those practices. But what role does Samoa's customs play in the country's law system in the first place?
It's a very interesting question, particularly in the context of the Pacific Islands. I guess I'll start off by saying, ideally, the laws and legal systems of a country should reflect the society and the people which it governs. And in most Pacific Island countries, including Samoa, the laws and legal systems of the Pacific Islands are a reflection of our colonial histories. It is a mixture of Western legal traditions and the indigenous customs of the Pacific peoples. Now, the Samoan Constitution makes several references to custom. The preamble of the Constitution, for example, states that Samoa is a country that is based on Christian principles and Samoan custom and tradition. The Constitution offers protection for customary rights, and this is through the creation of, specialized courts for land and title issues, or customary land and title matters. And these matters are resolved using Samoan custom. Right, so there's that protection offered in the Constitution. And in addition to that, custom is recognized as a source of law. So judges in Samoa may take custom into consideration when they are making a decision on a matter. So the recognition of a nifonga is one way that the Samoan courts are recognizing Samoan customs. Now, going to the competing aspects of introduced Western legal traditions and indigenous customs, it's an ongoing struggle, not only in Samoa, but in all Pacific countries that share a similar colonial history. How do we meaningfully incorporate the indigenous customs, which were developed by our people for our people, in our, adopted foreign legal systems? Right. So there's general consensus in the Pacific Islands, not just in Samoa, but there's general consensus that we want to meaningfully incorporate our customs into our legal systems, because, again, going back to the fact that, ideally our legal systems reflect our societies. But it hasn't always been such smooth sailing. It's an ongoing struggle. And I think you might remember the controversial amendments that were made to the Constitution of Samoa in 2020. One of the aims of those amendments, which saw the creation of the parallel court structure in Samoa, was that they wanted to strengthen the position of Samoan custom in the law. And by doing so, they tried to make they did make those controversial amendments to that.
Just to hone in our conversation around the ifonga, what effect does that have on the country's court of law?
It's a mitigating factor which has been used in assault, sexual offense, and homicide cases, so manslaughter, murder. And while it's a mitigating factor, it does not absolve the offender of criminal responsibility. Now, there's no set discount for ifonga, so just because you do it doesn't mean you get like a certain deduction from your sentence. The weight that is given to the ifonga depends on the circumstances of the case, and often the court will try to determine how genuine the ifonga was. And by doing so, they take into consideration a variety of factors. So how involved was the offender in the ifonga? In some cases, you had the offender's family doing the ifonga without the offender. Another thing they consider is the time frame, such as the one you saw in that article where it was done 2 years after the offending had happened. And also the amount of the gifts exchanged. So these are all factors the court will consider when determining how much of a deduction to make to the sentence. So hopefully that provides a little more background.
But does ifonga have any sort of direct outcomes, or does it serve justice for the victim in question?
The acceptance of the ifonga signifies that a matter has been forgiven and resolved. In relation to the victim, they do receive some form of material wealth, right? Because after an ifonga is accepted, there's an exchange of cultural gifts, such as money, ietonga, food items, livestock, right? So there's that immediate influx of material wealth, right? In some cases. But ideally, there's closure for the victim themselves, but also for their family and their community, right? It's all about maintaining peace and stability within the community. That being said, however, the recognition of customary reconciliation as a mitigating factor in criminal sentencing in the Pacific has been subject to great criticism. As we see in the Samoan case at hand, there is the unfortunate potential for abuse because offenders try to attempt to perform an ifonga to decrease the punishment that they receive. Additionally, customary reconciliation as a mitigating factor has also been criticized in the wider Pacific because, one, it's considered discriminatory particularly when it's being used in sexual offenses and domestic violence offenses, because the overwhelming majority of the offenders in those cases are males. In addition to that, critics have also argued that customary reconciliation does not adequately take into consideration the victim during the process, right? Instead of trying to address the victim's suffering, instead the reconciliation is an engagement between the families, right? And sometimes, not often, involving the victim, but it's to preserve social relations within the community, and therefore bringing into question whether or not there is genuine remorse and genuine forgiveness, right? So in other Pacific countries, for example, in Kiribati, the courts have previously held that traditional reconciliations will not be considered as a mitigating factor when sentencing for rape, particularly where there's been violence in the commission of that offense. So it's a mixed bag.
Do you think then there should be some sort of reforms into how customary laws are recognized in Samoa's legal system, especially when it comes to crime? Because from a traditional point of view, while the matter has been settled, the victim still lives with the trauma.
I definitely agree. However, I do think it would be remiss to remove the cultural significance and value of the ifonga in criminal sentencing. But then the question remains, how do we prevent those abuses? And I think the stern warning given by Justice Rui is a great example of how Samoa is trying to address these issues, right? The strength of Samoa's legal system is doing great to its esteemed judiciary. The Samoan bench is unique from other Pacific islands because it is comprised of Samoan judges who are also Matai and are knowledgeable in Samoan custom and knowledgeable in the nuances that are associated with their customary practices. And I have every confidence in the great wisdom and expertise of our esteemed judges in Samoa as they try to work to address these issues. But in addition to that, it is also on us, the Samoan people, to remind ourselves of our cultural values and to maintain the mamalu of our cultural practices. We should not be taking our dignified customary practices lightly. We should not be losing sight of the true essence of our cultural values and practices.
That's Pacific Waves for today. To listen back, head over to rnz.co.nz/Pacific. We're also on Spotify, Apple and iHeartRadio. From myself and the RNZ Pacific team, tō whā soifua.